The dying light painted the alkali desert in shades of rust and gold, while the wind whipped sand against Eve McKenna's face like tiny needles. The 27-year-old physician urged her mare through a forest of towering saguaro cacti, their arms raised like surrendering soldiers against the darkening sky. She'd received word that morning, a hastily scrawled note delivered by a Mexican boy who'd vanished before she could ask questions. Someone needed help out past Skeleton Ridge, where the salt flats met the red rocks. Eve had learned not to ask too many questions in Arizona territory. In 1879, asking questions could get you killed as quick as a rattlesnake strike. She found him sprawled in the white salt dust, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. The man was clearly of mixed blood, his skin burnished copper, his features carrying both the sharp angles of his Indian mother and something else, perhaps Irish or Scottish from his father's side. A broken arrow shaft protruded from his shoulder, the wound black with dried blood and desert grime. Eve dismounted quickly, her medical bag hitting the ground with a soft thud. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak and thready, but fighting. His breathing came in short, labored gasps that spoke of infection setting in. The sweet, sick smell confirmed her fears. The man stirred slightly, mumbling something in a language she didn't understand, likely Apache or Yavapai mixed with broken English. His eyes remained closed, but his lips moved constantly, speaking to ghosts only he could see. Eve knew she should leave him. The broken arrow, the location, the horse tracks she'd noticed circling the area, everything pointed to this being one of the train robbers the Southern Pacific Railroad had put bounties on. The decent folk of Drybell would say a woman had no business saving such a man, especially not a woman who'd already scandalized them by practicing medicine. But Eve had stopped caring what decent folk thought the day she'd buried her husband. She examined the wound more closely. The arrowhead was lodged deep, probably touching bone. Moving him would be dangerous. But leaving him here meant certain death, already. The turkey vultures were circling overhead, their shadows passing over the salt flats like dark omens. Well, she muttered to herself, Edmund always said I was too stubborn for my own good. Getting the man onto her horse proved nearly impossible. He was tall, over 6 feet, and solid muscle despite his lean build. Eve had to use every trick she'd learned growing up on an Ohio farm, finally managing to drape him across her mare's back like a sack of grain. The horse protested, dancing sideways, but Eve held firm. The ride back to her cabin took forever. The sun sank behind the Bradshaw Mountains, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Eve led the horse on foot, steadying the unconscious man with one hand while navigating the treacherous terrain of red rocks and hidden arroyos. Every few minutes, she checked to make sure he was still breathing. The cabin sat tucked into a narrow canyon, sheltered from the worst of the desert winds. Eve had claimed it after Edmund's death, when the good Christians of Drybell had made it clear a widow practicing medicine wasn't welcome in town. The isolation suited her fine out here. She could work without the constant disapproval of those who thought women should limit their healing to midwifery and herb gardens. She managed to drag the man inside, laying him on the narrow cot she used for patients. In the lamplight, she could see him better, despite the dirt and blood. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he hadn't always lived the hard life of an outlaw. Eve built up the fire and set water to boil. She laid out her instruments: forceps, probe, suturing needle, carbolic acid for cleaning. Her hands trembled slightly as she cut away his shirt, revealing the full extent of the damage. The arrow had entered just below his collarbone, missing the lung but tearing through muscle. Dark streaks radiating from the wound confirmed infection. As she worked, the man's fever-bright delirium continued. He called out a name, Marcus, and mumbled about a failed robbery, about needing food for the winter, about promises broken and trust betrayed. Eve tried not to listen, focused on the delicate task of extracting the arrowhead without causing more damage. The procedure took 2 hours. Eve's hands were steady now, her father's training taking over. He'd been a doctor too, back in Ohio, and he'd taught her everything despite society's objections. "Healing is healing," he'd said. "Don't matter who's doing it, long as it's done right." With the arrowhead removed, she cleaned the wound thoroughly with carbolic solution, packed it with clean lint, and sutured the torn flesh with careful stitches. The man groaned but didn't wake, lost in whatever visions the fever brought. Eve prepared a tea from willow bark and feverfew, spooning it carefully between his lips. Most dribbled down his chin, but she persisted. She'd seen too many strong men die from infection to give up easily. As night deepened, the desert cold crept in through every crack in the cabin walls. Eve added more wood to the fire and pulled her single chair close to the cot. She would need to monitor him through the night, changing his bandages every few hours and fighting to keep his fever down. The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, carrying with it the distant yip of coyotes and the haunting call of a great horned owl. Eve wrapped her shawl tighter and settled in for a long vigil. Outside, she could hear her mare nickering nervously in the lean-to shelter. Around midnight, the first snow began to fall, unusual for October. Even at this elevation, the flakes drifted down like ash, covering the red rocks in a thin white shroud. Eve watched through the single window, remembering another snowy night 3 years ago when she'd sat vigil over Edmund as the consumption slowly stole him away. All her medical knowledge hadn't been enough then. She looked down at the stranger on her cot, this man who might be a thief, a killer, or worse. His face had relaxed in unconsciousness, revealing surprisingly gentle features beneath the weathering of hard living. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of honest work alongside the gun calluses on his trigger finger. "Don't you die on me," she whispered. "I've had enough of death in this place." As if in response, he stirred slightly, his lips moving soundlessly. Eve leaned closer and caught a few words in English. "Sorry, didn't mean, just hungry." She sat back, pondering. The railroad companies painted the robbers as bloodthirsty savages, but here was a man apologizing in his delirium for trying to steal food. The West was full of such contradictions, civilization and wildness existing side by side, neither fully good nor fully evil. Dawn came slowly, creeping across the desert like spilled honey. The snow had stopped, leaving just enough to dust the canyon walls. Eve checked her patient one more time. His fever had broken sometime in the night, and his breathing was easier. He would live, if infection didn't take hold again. She stood, stretching her stiff muscles, and walked to the door. The desert stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving, beautiful in its harshness. Somewhere out there, men with guns and badges were looking for the stranger in her cabin. They would come eventually, they always did. But for now, in this moment, she had done what she'd sworn to do as a healer. She had preserved life. The rest, the questions, the judgment, the consequences would come later. Eve McKenna had learned that in the territory. You dealt with what was in front of you and worried about tomorrow when it came. She turned back inside to brew fresh willow bark tea, ready to face whatever this new day would bring. For 3 days, the fever held him in its grip like a stubborn dog with a bone. Eve barely left his side, alternating between pressing cool cloths to his burning forehead and checking his pulse with her late husband's pocket watch. She changed his bandages every few hours, watching for the telltale red streaks that meant blood poisoning. On the morning of the 4th day, consciousness flickered behind his eyelids like a candle flame. Eve was grinding herbs at her small table when she heard the cot creak. She turned to find him watching her, his dark eyes alert despite the deep shadows beneath them. "Water," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper on wood. Eve poured from the pitcher she kept ready, supporting his head as he drank. He winced at the movement but didn't cry out. When he'd had enough, he lay back, those watchful eyes scanning the cabin's simple interior, the medicine shelf with its neat rows of bottles, the picks and shovels in the corner. Edmund's Winchester mounted high on the wall. "Why?" he asked finally. Eve understood the question. Why save him? Why risk it? She settled back in her chair, meeting his gaze steadily. "Because you are still breathing," she said simply, "and because this land is too vast and hard for us to abandon each other." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "Even if that other is a thief." "Are you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "My name is Caleb Whitehawk," he said after a long pause. "And yes, ma'am, I rode with Marcus Redstone's bunch, though I doubt there's much of a bunch left after what happened at Copper Creek." Before Eve could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Multiple riders, moving fast. Caleb's face went pale beneath his copper skin. "They're hunting us," he whispered. "You need to—" But Eve was already moving. She doused the fire, scattered the ashes, and pulled a canvas over the medical supplies. Within minutes, the cabin looked abandoned. She helped Caleb to the root cellar, ignoring his groans of pain. "Stay quiet," she hissed, lowering the trap door. The riders passed close enough that dust filtered through the window cracks. Eve recognized Deputy Sam Morrison's voice, along with several others she didn't know. They spoke of rewards, of making examples, of the railroad's determination to clean out every last savage who dared interfere with progress. After they passed, Eve waited another hour before letting Caleb up. He was gray with pain and effort, fresh blood seeping through his bandages. "You shouldn't have," he began, but Eve cut him off. "I'll decide what I should and shouldn't do in my own home," she said sharply, already preparing fresh bandages. As she worked, Caleb studied her. This woman with her steady hands and fierce independence puzzled him. She moved with the efficiency of someone used to being alone, yet there was a sadness in the set of her shoulders that spoke of loss. "Your husband?" he asked, nodding toward a daguerreotype on the shelf, a young man with kind eyes and a scholar's face. "Edmund," Eve said quietly. 3 years gone. Consumption." "I'm sorry." "So was I. Still am." She tied off the new bandage with practiced movements. "Now drink this. It's corn porridge with bone broth. You need to rebuild your strength." Caleb ate slowly, his body still weak, between spoonfuls. He found himself talking about his white father who'd disappeared when he was 7, about his Apache mother who'd taught him to read sign in the saguaro spines and weather in the flight of hawks, about the hunger year when drought killed the crops and game, driving their small band to desperate measures. "We didn't set out to be robbers," he said. "Started just trying to get food, supplies, but once you crossed that line—" He trailed off, staring at something only he could see. Eve listened without judgment, recognizing the tone of a man trying to make sense of his own choices. She'd heard it before, from patients wrestling with more than physical wounds. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The cabin's thin walls did little to keep out the cold that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. Eve added wood to the fire, but it wasn't enough. She could see Caleb shivering despite the blankets, his body too weak to generate its own heat. She hesitated, then made a practical decision. Taking another blanket, she lay down beside him, careful not to jostle his injured shoulder. It was what one did in the territory when survival was at stake. Shared warmth meant shared life. Caleb stiffened at first, then gradually relaxed. In the darkness, with only the fires crackling for company, the intimacy felt both strange and natural. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured, "bringing danger to your door." Danger was already at my door. Eve replied, "A woman alone, practicing medicine without the town's blessing. I've had threats before." "From who?" "Those who think healing should come with a beard and a proper medical college degree. Those who think a woman's place is darning socks and baking bread." Her voice held bitter amusement. "As if disease cares about such proprieties." They lay in silence for a while, their breathing gradually synchronizing. Outside, an owl called, its voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Tell me about the robbery," Eve said finally. "The one that went wrong." Caleb was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "We got word about a payroll shipment. Just money. We thought enough to buy supplies for the winter, maybe head down to Mexico until things cooled off. But they were waiting. Someone had sold us out." His voice grew distant, reliving the ambush. "Marcus took 3 bullets. Tommy Littlefoot died trying to drag him to cover. The rest scattered. I barely made it out. Caught that arrow from one of the Apache scouts the army hired. And now I'm done," he said with quiet certainty. "If I survive this, I'm done with that life. Tired of running. Tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of becoming what they already think I am." Eve understood that exhaustion. After Edmund's death, she'd been tired, too tired of fighting for respect. Tired of defending her choices, but she'd learned that exhaustion could be a kind of beginning, a clearing away of what no longer served. Dawn came pale and cold, revealing frost on the canyon walls. Eve rose carefully, leaving Caleb sleeping, and went to check her horse. The mare nickered softly, breath steaming in the frigid air. As she broke ice on the water trough, Eve noticed fresh horse tracks leading toward town. The searchers would be back, and next time they might not pass by so easily. She needed supplies: carbolic acid, laudanum, fresh bandages, but showing her face in Drybell now would raise questions. Back inside, she found Caleb attempting to sit up, his face tight with pain but determined. "You need to stay flat," she ordered. "Those stitches are holding fine thanks to your skill," he finished. "But I can't stay on my back forever. And you can't keep harboring me. They'll find out eventually. Let me worry about that." "It's not just worry," Caleb said. "It's reality. The railroad has deep pockets and long memories. They'll—" A knock at the door cut him off. Not the aggressive pounding of a posse, but a polite tap. Eve grabbed Edmund's pistol from the drawer, holding it behind her back as she cracked the door open. Young Timothy Morrison stood on her doorstep. The deputy's nephew, all of 16 and trying to grow into his father's badge. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," he said, touching his hat brim. "Uncle Sam sent me to warn you. That Whitehawk fellow might be in these parts. Said you should keep your doors locked and—" His eyes flicked to something behind her, widening slightly. Eve kept her expression neutral. "Thank you for the warning. Timothy, I'll be careful." The boy lingered, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, "Ma'am, you helped my sister when she had the fever last spring. Didn't charge nothing when you knew we couldn't pay." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There's talk in town. Lyle Davenport's putting together his own hunting party. Railroad money. They ain't planning on bringing nobody in alive." Before Eve could respond, he'd turned and mounted his horse, riding away without looking back. Eve closed the door slowly, her mind racing. Lyle Davenport, she knew the name, a would-be cattle baron who'd thrown in with the railroad, seeing opportunity in their expansion. A man who viewed the territory's original inhabitants as obstacles to be removed. She turned to find Caleb standing, one hand braced against the wall. His face was grim. "You heard?" He nodded. "Davenport's been wanting me dead since I refused to scout for him against my mother's people. This gives him the excuse. Then we'd better make sure you're strong enough to move when they come." Eve said practically, "Sit down before you fall down, and let me check those stitches." As she worked, neither spoke of the night they'd shared for warmth, but awareness hummed between them like a taut wire. In saving his life, Eve had bound their fates together. Whatever came next, they would face it as allies in a land that demanded nothing less than everything from those who dared to call it home. Word spread through Drybell like wildfire. In August, the widow doctor was harboring a bandit. By the time Eve rode into town for supplies, she could feel eyes tracking her from behind curtained windows. At Morrison's general store, conversations died when she entered. Mrs. McKenna. Reverend Josiah Blackwood stepped into her path as she selected bandages. His thin face wore its usual expression of pious disapproval. I trust you've heard the concerns about your activities. I've heard gossip, Eve replied evenly, adding carbolic acid to her basket. Same as always. This is more than gossip. Mayor Hutchins had joined them, his belly straining against his brocade vest. Behind him stood Walter Crenshaw, who owned the Desert Rose Saloon and half the town's debts. You're endangering decent folk by hiding that savage. I'm treating a wounded man. Eve said, Same as I treated your son's broken arm. Mayor, or have you forgotten? Hutchins flushed. That was different. Was it? Healing is healing. Gentlemen, the oath I took doesn't distinguish between saints and sinners. Oath, Blackwood sputtered. What oath can a woman take that means anything? You're playing at being a doctor, and now you're endangering... Reverend... Eve interrupted quietly. I seem to recall your wife screaming for me when your daughter had scarlet fever. Funny how my sex didn't matter then. She paid for her supplies, ignoring Morrison's reluctant acceptance of her money. As she loaded her saddlebags, young Timothy appeared at her elbow. Railroad men were here yesterday, he whispered. Davenport's hired guns. They're offering $50 to anyone who spots Whitehawk. Pa says they'll burn out anyone hiding him. Eve looked at the boy steadily. And what does your conscience say? Timothy. He shifted uncomfortably. Says a man ought to stand trial before he's shot. Says healing folk ain't no crime. He glanced around nervously. There's talk of riding out to your place tomorrow, making an example. Eve pressed a silver dollar into his hand. For the information. And Timothy, thank you. She rode back through gathering clouds, her mind churning. The medical supplies would last perhaps 2 weeks. Caleb was healing but still weak. Moving him now risked reopening the wound, but waiting meant certain discovery. She found him sitting on the porch, Edmund's old shirt hanging loose on his frame. He'd managed to wash and shave, revealing a face younger than she'd expected. With high cheekbones and a firm jaw, he was whittling a piece of juniper, the movements careful and precise. You shouldn't be up, she said, dismounting. Couldn't stand another minute in that bed. He studied her face. Bad news in town? Eve told him about the threats, Davenport's bounty, the planned raid. Caleb listened without interruption, his hands never pausing in their work. I'll leave tonight, he said when she finished. Head for the border. You'll bleed out before you make 5 miles. Eve unpacked her supplies with sharp movements. And they'll track you easily. Blood leaves a trail even I could follow. Then what do you suggest? She was quiet for a moment, watching storm clouds build over the superstitions. We prepare. We make you strong enough to travel, and we do it smart. That evening, they developed a routine born of necessity. Eve taught Caleb how to properly clean instruments and prepare bandages. He showed her how to read weather signs and track patterns, 2 different kinds of knowledge, traded like currency. Your mother's people, Eve asked as they worked. Where are they now? Scattered. His voice held old pain. Some to San Carlos, some deeper into the mountains, some, like me, caught between worlds. He looked at his hands brown enough to mark him as other, pale enough to pass sometimes. Ma used to say I had a foot in 2 rivers but couldn't drink from either. Is that why you turned to robbing? Caleb considered. Part of it. When you don't belong anywhere, you make your own place. Marcus understood that. Most of his boys were mixed Apache Mexican, Cherokee Irish, breeds of all kinds. We were nobody's people, so we became our own. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The first fat raindrops spattered the dust as they hurried inside. Eve lit the lamps while Caleb built up the fire, their movements coordinated without discussion. Tell me about your husband, Caleb said as they settled in for the evening. You loved him. It wasn't a question. Eve touched Edmund's photograph reflexively. He was a good man, brilliant, kind. He believed I could be more than what the world said. She smiled sadly. He taught me Latin by lamplight, let me assist in his surgeries when no one was watching. When he died, the world got smaller, Caleb finished. Yes? She looked at him, surprised by his understanding. Exactly that. The storm struck in earnest, rain drumming the roof like war drums. They ate simple fair beans and cornbread while lightning illuminated the canyon in stark relief. The enforced intimacy of the small cabin pressed around them. I need to check your wound, Eve said, purely for something to break the tension. Caleb removed his shirt without protest. The wound was healing well. Pink new skin forming around her neat stitches. As she applied fresh salve, she was aware of his warmth, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Eve, he said quietly, when they come, and they will come, I won't let them hurt you for helping me. Her hand stilled. And how would you stop them? You can barely lift Edmund's rifle, much less shoot it. I'm getting stronger. Not strong enough. Not yet. She finished the bandage, her fingers lingering a moment too long. We need more time. The storm raged through the night. They sat by the fire, not quite touching, sharing stories of the territory. Caleb told her about finding ancient pottery in hidden canyons, about the way Ocotillo bloomed after rain like fire on green candles. Eve spoke of her first year alone, learning which plants healed and which killed, earning trust one patient at a time. You could have gone back east, Caleb observed, after your husband died. Easier life there for a woman with your skills. Easier, maybe, but not mine. Eve stared into the flames. This land, it's hard and unforgiving, but it's also honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. After Edmund died, I needed that honesty. Even if that honesty includes men like Davenport. Especially then. Back east, men like him hide behind civilized manners. Here, at least you see them coming. Dawn brought clear skies and deadly quiet. Eve knew that silence, it meant riders approaching, trying for surprise. She woke Caleb, helped him to the prepared hiding spot beneath the floorboards. The posse arrived with the full light, Davenport himself leading. Eve met them on the porch, Edmund's rifle prominent beside her. Mrs. McKenna. Davenport touched his hat with a mock courtesy. He was a big man, soft from good living but dangerous like a fed snake. We're looking for the breed who's been terrorizing honest folk. I haven't seen any terror, Eve replied. Just sick people needing help. Now. Davenport's smile was cold. No need for games. We know he's here. Found blood trail leading right to your canyon. You can make this easy. Or, he gestured to his men. Hard cases all, hands resting on gun butts. Or what you'll shoot a woman for practicing medicine. For harboring a criminal, absolutely. He leaned forward in his saddle. This territory's changing. Mrs. McKenna, no room for savage ways or women who forget their place. You'd do well to remember that. Eve met his gaze steadily. I remember everything, Mr. Davenport, including who begged me to save his son from snakebite last summer. Funny how my place seemed just fine then. Davenport's face darkened. Before he could respond, one of his men called out he'd found fresh bandages in the burn pile, stained with blood. Search the place, Davenport ordered. They tore through her cabin like locusts, overturning furniture, scattering medical supplies. Eve watched silently, memorizing faces. These weren't lawmen, but hired guns, the kind who'd kill for drinking money. When they found nothing, Davenport turned back to her. He'll surface eventually, and when he does, remember you chose the wrong side. After they left, Eve helped Caleb from his hiding place. He was pale, sweat beading his forehead from the effort of staying silent. They'll be back, he said. Yes? Eve surveyed the wreckage of her home. But not today. And tomorrow, you'll be stronger still." Together, they began putting the cabin to rights. Two people united now by more than circumstance. Outside, vultures circled something dead in the desert, patient as always. But in the cabin, life continued its stubborn insistence on hope, one breath at a time. Winter arrived with teeth bared, locking the canyon in walls of ice. The temperature plunged so low that water froze in the bucket before Eve could carry it inside. In her journal, she marked the beginning of what would become legend day one: "The cold may kill us both before Davenport gets his chance." That first night of the true cold snap, Eve woke to find Caleb shivering violently despite 3 blankets. His wound, though healing, had left him vulnerable to the elements. She checked his temperature dangerously low. "We need to share heat," she said matter-of-factly, though her heart hammered. "It's that or you risk losing fingers to frostbite." Caleb nodded, too cold to argue. Eve slipped under the blankets beside him, wrapping her arms around his trembling form. At first, they lay rigid as fence posts, aware of every point of contact, but as warmth slowly built between them, necessity overcame propriety. "Tell me about Ohio," Caleb said through chattering teeth. "Anything to take my mind off freezing." So Eve talked about green summers and maple syrup, about her father's medical practice in a white-clapboard house, about learning to suture on pigskin in the barn while her mother despaired of ever making a proper lady of her. "What made you leave?" Caleb asked, his shivering finally easing. "Edmund got an offer to help establish a practice out here. Adventure. He called it a chance to build something new." She smiled against the darkness. "He didn't mention the dust storms and gunfights." "Would you have come if he had?" Eve considered. "Yes, I think I was always meant for harder places." They fell into a pattern over the following nights. When the sun died, they would prepare for the cold together, banking the fire, heating stones to warm the bed, finally settling into their shared nest of blankets. The arrangement was purely practical. They told themselves, ignoring the way their bodies learned to fit together like puzzle pieces. During the days, Caleb grew stronger. He could now walk the length of the cabin without exhaustion, could hold Edmund's rifle steady. Eve taught him to read her medical texts, and he absorbed the knowledge hungrily. "You could have been a doctor yourself," she observed, watching him memorize the treatment for pneumonia. "Wrong color, wrong name," he said without bitterness. "But knowing might help someone someday." On the 10th night, a blizzard struck with violence that shook the cabin walls. Snow piled against the door, and wind screamed through every crack like vengeful spirits. They huddled together, fully dressed, as the temperature dropped beyond anything Eve had experienced. "Story for story," Caleb proposed, his breath warm against her ear. "Keep our minds working." Eve agreed, and they traded tales through the howling night. She told him about the first surgery she'd performed alone, an emergency amputation on a railroad worker while Edmund was away. How her hands had been steady even as men shouted that no woman should be doing such work. Caleb spoke of his mother's death from smallpox when he was 15, how he'd tried white man's medicine and traditional cures, but nothing had saved her. "That's when I stopped believing in any god," he said quietly. "Apache or Christian. What do you believe in now?" He was silent so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "Sunrise, coffee, the way sage smells after rain." His hand found hers under the blankets. The stubbornness of a woman who won't let a man die just because the world says she should. Eve squeezed his fingers, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. On the 20th night, the temperature rose just enough for snow to turn to freezing rain. Ice coated everything, turning the canyon into a crystal palace, beautiful and deadly. A lone mule wandered into their shelter, half frozen and desperate. They brought it into the lean-to with Eve's mare, grateful for another living thing surviving against odds. "We should name him," Eve said, bringing the animal water. "Moses," Caleb suggested. leading us to a promised land we can't see yet." The mules' arrival proved fortunate. As their food supplies dwindled, Caleb revealed knowledge of which roots and cacti remained edible even in winter. Using Moses to carry supplies, they foraged carefully, Eve learning to see the desert's hidden generosity. "Your people survived here for centuries," she said, watching him extract nutrients from a barrel cactus. "By paying attention," he replied, "the land teaches. If you listen." Night 25 brought disaster. The roof beam, weakened by snow weight, cracked ominously. Working together in the bitter cold, they managed to shore it up with the last of their lumber. But Eve's hands were clumsy with cold, and she sliced her palm on a splinter. Caleb cleaned and bandaged the wound with the same care she'd shown him. His hands were gentle but sure, and Eve found herself studying his face as he worked the concentration in his dark eyes, the way he bit his lower lip when focused. "There," he said, tying off the bandage. "Doctor's orders no heavy lifting for 2 days. Using my own words against me. Someone has to keep you from working yourself to death." That night, with her bandaged hand throbbing, Eve let Caleb hold her closer than mere warmth required. She told herself it was the pain, the exhaustion, the endless cold that made her burrow into his embrace. Not the way he smelled of juniper smoke and leather, not the steady beat of his heart under her ear. By day 30, they'd developed an entire language of small touches and shared glances. The forced intimacy had worn away pretense like water on stone. They knew each other's sleeping patterns, fears, dreams spoken aloud in the dark. After this, Caleb said one evening as they watched sunset paint the ice-covered rocks crimson, "What happens?" "We survive first," Eve said. "Plan later." But she was already planning, already imagining a future that included this man who'd entered her life bleeding and desperate. It was foolish, dangerous thinking. He was wanted. She was barely tolerated. Together, they'd be outcasts everywhere. Yet when night 37 brought the worst cold, yet pipes freezing solid, ice forming inside the cabin, and they clung together for survival, Eve admitted the truth to herself. Somewhere between that first night of shared warmth and this moment, she'd stopped saving a patient and started saving the man she loved. "Eve," Caleb whispered, his lips against her hair. "These nights, they've been—" "Don't," she interrupted softly. "Don't name it yet. We still have to make it through." On the 40th night, something shifted. The wind, constant companion for so long, stilled. The temperature, while still cold, no longer bit with killing teeth. They lay in their nest of blankets, both aware this might be the last night necessity demanded such closeness. 40 nights, Eve murmured. Biblical, almost. "Except we're not waiting for a flood to end," Caleb said. "We're waiting for life to begin." She turned in his arms to face him. In the dim firelight, his eyes were deep as the desert night. "Caleb." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a question more than a statement. Eve answered by pulling him closer, pouring weeks of unspoken feeling into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the air between them had changed forever. Dawn of the 41st day broke clear and bright. The ice began its slow retreat, dripping from the eaves like tears. Caleb rose first, testing his strength. The wound had healed to a pink scar, and he moved with his old grace. "I can travel now," he said quietly. Eve nodded, though her heart clenched. "Yes," but as she watched him stand in the doorway, silhouetted against the warming world, she saw not a man preparing to run, but one finally ready to stop. His eyes, when he turned back to her, were clear and fully open, as if seeing truly for the first time. "Or," he said slowly, "I could stay, help you rebuild, make something honest here." Eve rose and went to him, taking his hands in hers. "That's a dangerous choice. Davenport won't forget." "Neither will I," Caleb said, 40 nights you warmed me, body and soul. That's worth any danger. Outside, the desert began its slow return to life, ice melting to reveal the patient earth below. And in the doorway of a battered cabin, two people stood together, finally warm enough to choose love over mere survival. The spring thaw brought more than warmth, it brought people. Word spread that the widow doctor had kept her patient alive through the killing winter, and those who'd shunned Eve before now arrived at her door with ailments real and imagined. Caleb adapted to his new role with surprising ease. He learned to prepare poultices while Eve examined patients, to calm frightened children with stories, to organize supplies with military precision. When she rode out to distant homesteads, he accompanied her, rifle across his saddle, watching for trouble. "You make a fine nurse," Eve told him after a particularly long day treating miners' coughs. "My mother was a healer," he replied, "grinding willow bark. Different methods than yours, but the caring's the same." Their first real test came when the Delgado family arrived, their youngest burning with fever. The Mexican farmers had ridden through the night, desperate. Eve recognized the symptoms immediately: scarlet fever, potentially deadly. "We need isolation," she told Caleb quietly. "This could spread?" They converted the barn into a makeshift ward. For 3 days, Eve and Caleb took shifts, cooling fevers, forcing fluids, fighting death's grip on the 8-year-old boy. When Miguel finally opened his eyes and asked for water in a clear voice, his mother fell to her knees, blessing Eve in rapid Spanish. But she also blessed Caleb, calling him El Curandero Bendito, the blessed healer. Word of the mixed-blood man who helped the lady doctor spread through the Mexican community, then to the Chinese railroad workers, the freed slaves working the mines. Those whom Drybell's proper society ignored began to see the Canyon Clinic as their refuge. Not everyone approved. Eve returned from town one day to find a message nailed to her door: "Stop helping the mud races or burn with them." "Charming," Caleb said dryly, pulling the nail free. "Your neighbors have such a way with words." "They're scared," Eve said. "The town's changing. The railroad brings new people, new ideas. They're holding on to the old ways with both fists." "And Davenport?" "Waiting." She unpacked medical supplies, frowning at the inflated prices Morrison had charged. "He's too smart to move openly, but he's watching." The threat materialized sooner than expected. Eve was treating a knife wound on a young Apache when Davenport himself appeared, flanked by hired guns. "Practicing on your own kind now. Breed," he said to Caleb, ignoring Eve entirely. Caleb's hand moved toward Edmund's rifle, but Eve touched his arm. "Mr. Davenport, come for medical attention. You look dyspeptic." Davenport's face reddened. "I've come to inform you that the town council is reviewing your right to practice medicine. Seems there's questions about your qualifications." "My qualifications haven't changed since I saved your son from rattlesnake venom," Eve said calmly, though her heart raced. "Unless you'd prefer I hadn't. That was before you started living in sin with this savage." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eve felt Caleb tense beside her, but she kept her voice level. "Mr. Whitehawk is my medical assistant. Unless you have proof of impropriety, I suggest you leave." Davenport smiled coldly. "Proof? A white woman sharing quarters with a half-breed. What more proof does decent society need?" "The proof," said a new voice, "that their work saves lives." Father Miguel Torres stood in the doorway, his brown Franciscan robes dusty from riding. Behind him crowded others, the Delgado family, Chinese workers, a cluster of buffalo soldiers from the nearby fort. "These people heal without asking blood or birthright," the priest continued. "That seems very Christian to me." Faced with witnesses, Davenport retreated, but his parting words chilled. This isn't over. That evening, as they cleaned instruments, Caleb was unusually quiet. "He's not wrong," he finally said. My presence here compromises you. Eve set down her scalpel carefully. Caleb Whitehawk, if you're thinking of leaving for my protection, think again. I've made my choice. Have you? He turned to face her fully. Eve, I've been writing to people, trying to make things right. Most of my old gang is dead or scattered. But there's a federal marshal who might be willing to… To what? Arrest you fairly? Eve shook her head. Caleb, men like Davenport don't want justice. They want examples. A rider interrupted their discussion, a mining accident. 5 men trapped. They rode out immediately. Medical bags bouncing against their horses' flanks. The scene was chaos, collapsed timber, choking dust, women weeping. Eve took charge. You 3 start digging carefully from the left. Caleb, check that support beam. If anyone's alive, they'll need air first. They worked through the night, Eve directing rescue efforts while preparing for casualties. When they finally broke through, 3 men survived broken bones, dust-filled lungs, but alive. Eve and Caleb worked in seamless harmony, setting bones, clearing airways, issuing orders that were instantly obeyed. Never seen anything like it. One grizzled miner said. That breed knew exactly where to dig, like he could hear through the earth. Caleb caught Eve's eye, a small smile playing at his lips. She knew what he was thinking. His mother's people did know how to listen to the earth. Some knowledge transcended medical texts. Exhausted, they returned to the canyon as dawn broke. Eve stumbled with fatigue, and Caleb steadied her, his arm strong around her waist. We make a good team, he said softly. Yes, she agreed. We do. Inside, she turned to him, decision crystallizing. Marry me. Caleb froze. Eve. I'm serious, not for propriety or protection, but because I want to, because these past months have shown me what partnership truly means. She took his hands. Because I love you. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. You impossible woman? Yes, though God knows what priest will perform it. Father Miguel will, Eve said confidently. He sees hearts, not colors. The ceremony took place 2 weeks later in the canyon, witnessed by their grateful patients. Father Miguel spoke words of blessing in Spanish, English, and Latin, while Chinese lanterns swayed in the mesquite trees and Apache wedding songs echoed off the rocks. Davenport made one last attempt, arriving with the sheriff during the reception. This union isn't legal, he declared. Miscegenation is not illegal in the territory. Father Miguel interrupted smoothly. I checked very thoroughly. The sheriff, who owed Eve for treating his daughter's pneumonia, shrugged apologetically at Davenport. Nothing I can do if it's legal. Lyle. Defeated but not broken. Davenport left with a warning. When the territory becomes a state, things will change. Your kind won't be welcome. Then we'll face that when it comes, Eve said, her hand in Caleb's. As the sun set on their wedding day, the canyon filled with music and laughter, Mexican guitars, Chinese drums, Apache flutes, freed slaves, spirituals. All the voices Davenport wanted silenced, raised in celebration. No regrets, Caleb asked as they stood apart, watching their guests. None, Eve said firmly. You. He kissed her forehead. I regret the path that brought me here, but not where it led. Later, as their guests departed, pressing gifts of food and handmade goods into their hands, Eve realized they'd built something more than a medical practice. They'd created a community of the overlooked and unwanted, bound together by survival and hope. Tomorrow, we expand the clinic, she said, planning aloud. That mining accident showed we need more space for emergencies. Tomorrow, Caleb agreed. But tonight was theirs, earned through blood and trust, cold nights and hard choices. As stars emerged above the canyon walls, doctor and outlaw turned healer faced their future together, ready for whatever battles morning might bring. The shot rang out just after dawn, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Eve jerked awake to find Caleb already at the window, rifle in hand. "Stay down," he whispered. Another shot, closer, then shouting, "Harrison's dead, the breed killed James Harrison." Eve's blood ran cold. James Harrison was a prominent merchant, one of Davenport's inner circle. She started to rise, but Caleb pulled her back. "I was here all night," he said urgently. "You know I was." "I know, but they won't care about truth." The mob arrived within the hour. 20 men strung with rope already knotted into a noose. Davenport sat his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. "Send him out, Mrs. Whitehawk," he called, using her married name like a curse, "or we'll burn you out." Eve stepped onto the porch, still in her nightdress, but with Edmund's pistol visible in her hand. "My husband was here all night. Whatever happened to Mr. Harrison? Caleb had no part in it." "Convenient," sneered Jake Sutter, Davenport's right hand, his squaw providing an alibi. Deputy Morrison pushed through the crowd, his young face troubled. "Now hold on. We need evidence, not just accusations." "Evidence." Davenport produced a leather pouch. Harrison was shot with a .44, 40, same caliber as Breed's favor. Found these tracks leading from his store moccasin prints. "Half the territory wears moccasins," Eve said, "including white men who find them practical." "She's got a point," Morrison said uncertainly. Davenport's face darkened. "Boy, you decide right now, are you law, or are you another Breed lover?" Before Morrison could answer, Caleb emerged, hands raised but head high. "I'll come peacefully, but I want a proper trial." "You'll get what you deserve," Davenport growled. They bound Caleb's hands, ignoring Eve's protests about his recent injury. As they led him away, he caught her eye. "Find the truth," he said quietly. Eve didn't waste time on tears. She saddled her mare and rode hard for town. Arriving at the makeshift jail, really just a reinforced shed to find a crowd already gathering. Someone had erected a gallows in the square, its shadow falling across the dusty street like a promise. "When's the trial?" she demanded of Morrison. The deputy wouldn't meet her eyes. "Judge is coming from Prescott. Few days, maybe." Days Eve knew what that meant. Frontier justice wouldn't wait for judges. She pushed into the jail. Caleb sat on a wooden bench, bruises already forming on his face. They'd beaten him, though not badly yet. "I need to examine Harrison's body," she said. "As the only doctor in 50 miles, it's my duty." Morrison hesitated, then nodded. "He's at the undertaker's." Eve found Harrison laid out on a pine board, still in his blood-stained clothes. She examined the wound carefully, noting the angle, the powder burns, the pattern of blood. Something wasn't right. "Mrs. Whitehawk." She turned to find Samuel Chen, who ran the laundry. His usual deference was replaced by urgency. "I saw something," he whispered. "Last night, but they won't listen to a Chinaman." "Tell me." Mr. Harrison met someone at his store, late, after midnight. White man, fancy clothes. They argued." "Did you see his face?" Chen shook his head. But he dropped something. He produced a silver cufflink, monogrammed R.B. Eve's mind raced. Robert Brennan Davenport's business partner in several shady land deals. She pocketed the evidence. "Say nothing to anyone else," she warned. "Your life depends on it." She spent the day investigating, calling on every skill Caleb had taught her about reading sign. The tracks from Harrison's store were too convenient, too clear. Real fugitives didn't leave such obvious trails. And the moccasin prints, the pattern was wrong, like someone unfamiliar with proper wear had made them. At the Mercantile, she talked to Harrison's clerk, a nervous young man named Peters. Mr. Harrison was worried," Peters admitted. Said someone was pressuring him about his accounts. He kept records, lots of them. Where? Hidden. He showed me once loose floorboard under the counter. Eve found the papers that night, breaking into the closed store with skills she'd never admit to learning. The ledgers told a clear story Harrison had been skimming from his partnership with Davenport and Brennan. Recent entries showed increasing desperation. Armed with evidence, she returned to the jail. Morrison was alone, struggling with his conscience. "Deputy, I can prove Caleb's innocence," she said, "but I need your help." She laid out what she'd found. Morrison's face paled as he realized the implications. "If Davenport's involved, then we need to act fast. How long before that mob decides they've waited long enough for a judge?" As if in answer, shouts rose from the saloon. Through the window, they could see men gathering, passing bottles, working up courage and hatred in equal measure. "Get your husband out the back," Morrison said suddenly. "I'll delay them. You'll be ruined, maybe killed." The young deputy straightened. "Your husband saved my sister with that Apache medicine when she had the fever. This is right." Eve found Caleb alert. Ready. They slipped out as Morrison confronted the mob out front, buying precious minutes. But Davenport had posted guards. Shots erupted as they ran for the horses. Caleb stumbled, clutching his side. Not the old wound, a new one, bleeding fresh. Eve half carried him to cover behind the water trough. "Go," he gasped. "Get help." "Not without you." The mob surrounded them, torches casting hellish light. Davenport dismounted, revolver drawn. "Enough running. String him up." "Wait." Eve stood, shielding Caleb. "I have proof of who really killed Harrison." She held up the ledgers, speaking fast. "Harrison was stealing from you. Davenport, from you and Brennan. When he tried to back out, Brennan killed him and framed Caleb." "Lies," Davenport snarled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Then explain this." Eve produced the cufflink. Found at the murder scene, R.B. Robert Brennan. The mob murmured. Some of them had dealt with Brennan, knew his reputation for violence when crossed. "She's right," the voice came from the shadows. Brennan himself stepped out, immaculate despite the hour, but his right cuff was missing its link. Robert Davenport's voice held dangerous softness. Brennan smiled coldly. Harrison was becoming a liability. As for framing the breed two birds, one stone, your obsession with him made it perfect. You used me. We used each other. But now, Brennan raised his own gun. The night exploded. Caleb, despite his wound, managed to knock Eve aside as bullets flew. Morrison appeared with several townsmen who'd chosen law over mob rule. In the chaos, Brennan tried to flee but was brought down by, of all people, Sam Chen, who proved surprisingly adept with a pickaxe handle. When the smoke cleared, Brennan lay groaning with a broken arm. Davenport stood frozen, his empire of intimidation crumbling as men realized he'd been played for a fool. "It's over, Lyle," Morrison said, badge glinting in the torchlight. "All of it." Eve knelt by Caleb, pressing cloth to his wound. It was bad, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through flesh without hitting organs. "You impossible woman," he murmured, risking everything again. "Learned from the best," she replied, tears streaming. "Now shut up and let me work." Dawn found them in the clinic, Caleb stitched and bandaged, sleeping off laudanum. Brennan was locked up awaiting transport to Prescott. Davenport had disappeared in the night, his power broken. Morrison, promoted to full sheriff by grateful townspeople, visited as Eve cleaned instruments. "Town owes you both an apology," he said, "and more. We'll settle for being left in peace." Eve replied, "That you'll have word spreading about what really happened. Folks are ashamed of how quick they were to judge." After he left, Eve sat beside Caleb, holding his hand. They'd survived again, But she knew the scars ran deeper than flesh. The West was changing. Slowly, but change came hard and bloody. Caleb's eyes fluttered open. Did we win? We survived. Sometimes that's the same thing. He squeezed her fingers weakly. Worth it, all of it, to stand in the light with you. Eve kissed his forehead, tasting salt and gunpowder and hope. Outside, the sun rose on a new day in Dry Bell, one where justice had prevailed by the narrowest margin. It wasn't enough, might never be enough, but it was a start. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Eve read it twice before the words sank in. Pack your things and leave. Go back east where you belong. This is your only warning. She crumpled the paper, tossing it into the cook stove. Another love note from our admirers. Caleb looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. How many does that make? 4th this month. Eve continued grinding herbs, refusing to let her hands shake. They're getting less creative. But that night, she lay awake listening to every sound. Caleb's breathing beside her was steady, his wound healing well. But she knew he was awake too. Neither spoke of the fear that pooled in the darkness between them. The next morning brought purpose. Eve loaded her medical bag with extra supplies while Caleb checked the ammunition. The Paiute camp needs attention, she said. That outbreak of fever is 30 miles into rough country. Caleb finished. Perfect place for an ambush. Perfect place for people who need help. Eve's jaw set in the stubborn line he knew well. I won't let threats keep me from my work. They rode out together, Moses the mule carrying supplies. The desert stretched endlessly, saguaro cacti standing sentinel against the brass sky. Every shadow could hide danger. Every canyon echo might be hoofbeats. But they reached the camp unmolested. The Paiute had been hit hard by fever, children listless in their mother's arms. Eve worked tirelessly, showing the women how to prepare willow bark tea, how to recognize dangerous symptoms. Caleb translated, his mother's teaching serving him well. She says you have gentle hands, he told Eve as an elderly woman blessed her, hands that heal instead of hurt. They were packing to leave when a young boy ran up, chattering rapidly in Paiute. Caleb's face darkened. Riders coming, many of them. Eve's heart hammered, but she kept her voice calm. Davenport's men. The boy doesn't know, but they're moving fast, with purpose. The Paiute melted into the landscape with practiced ease, leaving Eve and Caleb exposed. They mounted quickly, but it was too late. Dust clouds on 3 sides announced their trap. The canyon, Caleb said, pointing to a narrow defile. It's our only chance. They rode hard, Moses braying in protest. The canyon walls rose around them, red rock stained darker by shadow. Behind them, shouts and gunfire erupted. The passage narrowed until they had to ride single file. Caleb led, finding a path where none seemed to exist. Eve followed, trusting his instincts, medical bag bouncing against her hip. A shot rang out, chips of rock exploding near Eve's head. Their pursuers had reached the canyon mouth. There, Caleb pointed to a side passage, barely wide enough for horses. They squeezed through, emerging onto a ledge overlooking a dry wash. Below, their pursuers milled in confusion. Eve recognized several faces, men who'd ridden with Davenport, but also new ones, harder faces that spoke of professional killing rather than local prejudice. Railroad money, Caleb said grimly. Davenport might be gone, but his friends aren't. They waited until dark, then picked their way down the far side of the ridge. The journey home took twice as long, circling wide to avoid pursuit. Dawn found them exhausted but alive. The clinic's familiar walls a welcome sight. But something was wrong. The door hung askew, lock broken. Inside, devastation medicine smashed, instruments scattered, furniture overturned. On the wall, painted in what looked like blood, last warning. Eve sank into a chair, surveying the wreckage of their work. Months of careful building, destroyed in moments of hatred. We could leave, Caleb said quietly. Start over somewhere else. Could we? Eve's voice was bitter. Where exactly is this magical place that welcomes mixed couples and doesn't mind women doctors? He knelt beside her, taking her hands. Then we rebuild. Again. I'm tired of rebuilding. The words came out broken. Tired of fighting for every scrap of respect, every moment of peace. I know. He pulled her close, and she finally let the tears come. But what else is there we give up? They win. Every patient we can't treat, every life we can't save, that's their victory. A knock interrupted them. Eve tensed, but Caleb recognized the rhythm their signal with friendly visitors. He opened the door to find Father Miguel and, surprisingly, a dozen townspeople. We heard what happened, the priest said. We've come to help. They filed in the Delgado family, Sam Chen and his sons, several minors Eve had treated, even Margaret Morrison, the sheriff's wife. Without words, they began cleaning, sorting, salvaging what could be saved. Why? Eve asked Margaret, who was carefully collecting scattered instruments. The older woman's face was stern but kind. Because some of us are tired too. Tired of fear ruling this town. Tired of good people being driven out by bad. By noon, the clinic was functional again. People brought supplies. Chen had somehow procured new medicine bottles. Miners contributed lumber for shelves. The Delgados offered food for the workers. It's not charity, insisted Tom Walsh, a grizzled prospector Eve had saved from gangrene. It's investment. This town needs you both. Sheriff Morrison arrived as they were finishing. His face was grim. Got word from Prescott. There's a federal marshal coming to investigate the railroad's interests in the territory. Seems some folks back east don't like what they're hearing about company towns and private armies. How long until he arrives? Caleb asked. Week, maybe 2. Until then. Morrison hesitated. Until then, you might want to accept some protection. From whom? Eve's tone was skeptical. From us, said a new voice. Carlos Mendoza stood in the doorway, flanked by several vaqueros. Caleb's old riding companion looked older, harder, but his eyes held determination. Some debts can only be paid in blood and bullets. Compadre. Carlos. Caleb started, but his friend cut him off. You saved my sister's baby when the midwife gave up. You think I forget? He turned to Eve. We'll watch the canyon. Anyone comes who shouldn't, they'll answer to us. Eve looked around the room. Brown faces, white faces, yellow faces, all united by something stronger than fear. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep healing, Father Miguel suggested. That's all any of us ask. That night, with guards posted and the clinic restored, Eve and Caleb sat on their porch watching the stars. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving as always, but somehow less lonely. I was wrong earlier, Eve said, about being tired. Oh, I am tired, but I'm not defeated. She leaned against him, feeling his solid warmth. They want us to run, to hide, to give up. Every day we don't is a victory. The marshal might change things, Caleb offered. Federal law trumps local prejudice. Maybe. Or maybe he'll be bought like the others. Eve sighed. But either way, we'll be here, healing who needs it, regardless of what anyone thinks. A coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The desert's night music, unchanged by human dramas. Eve found comfort in that continuity. Your mother's people, she said suddenly. They survived centuries of people trying to drive them out. Still surviving, Caleb corrected. Changed, scattered, but still here. Then we can too. Eve stood, pulling him up. Come, I want to show you something. In the clinic, she opened Edmund's old desk. revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a leather journal and a small leather pouch. "Edmund's emergency fund," she explained. "Gold coins, enough to start over anywhere. I've never touched it." "And now?" Eve handed him the pouch. "Now we use it for what it was meant for, building a future, a real clinic, with proper walls and a surgery, maybe even an apprentice program for those who want to learn." Caleb weighed the gold thoughtfully. "It'll make us a bigger target, or a harder one to move." Eve's smile was fierce. "Let them come. We'll be ready." They spent the rest of the night planning not escape routes, but foundations, not retreat, but advancement. When dawn came, it found them asleep at the table, hands linked over sketches of buildings that would rise from desert sand like monuments to stubborn hope. Outside, Carlos's men kept watch, their presence a reminder that courage, like hatred, could be contagious. And somewhere in the distance, a federal marshal rode toward Drybell, carrying either justice or just another disappointment. Either way, Eve and Caleb would face it together, rooted now in this hard land that tested everything but gave back strength to those who endured. The morning arrived gray as old dishwater, with wind that cut through cloth like accusations. Caleb stood at the narrow pass leading into their canyon, Carlos beside him, both men reading the signs in the dust. 20 riders, maybe more," Carlos said, spitting tobacco juice. "Moving slow, careful." "Davenport's back," Caleb confirmed. "With friends." They'd known this was coming. The federal marshal had been delayed conveniently. Some said, and Davenport had used the time to gather forces, not just local muscle, but hired guns from Texas and Missouri. Men who killed for gold and slept sound after. Eve was already preparing the clinic when Caleb returned. She'd sent their patients away at dawn. The Delgado family taking young Timothy Morrison, who was recovering from pneumonia. Now she loaded Edmund's rifle, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. "We could still leave," Caleb said, though he knew her answer. "And let them burn everything we've built." Eve shook her head. "They want to make examples of us, show what happens to those who step out of line. Then we make our own example." By noon, Davenport's force had surrounded the canyon. The man himself rode forward under a white flag, though his smile promised anything but peace. "Mrs. McKenna," he called, using her maiden name deliberately. "Or whatever you're calling yourself these days, this is your last chance. Send out the breed, leave this territory, and I might let you live." Eve stepped onto the porch, rifle prominent. "The only one leaving is you, Davenport, the federal marshal." "Isn't coming," Davenport interrupted. "Seems he met with an unfortunate accident. Apaches, they say, terrible thing." His smile widened. "Now, about my offer." A shot rang out, dirt exploding at Davenport's horse's feet. Carlos, from his position in the rocks, called down, "That's close enough, pendejo." Davenport's face darkened. "You've got 5 minutes to decide, then we'd burn you out." As he rode back to his men, Eve and Caleb exchanged glances. They both knew what burning out meant: no survivors, no witnesses, just another tragedy blamed on Indians or bandits. "How many fighters do we have?" Eve asked. 8, counting us. Caleb replied. "Carlos and 3 vaqueros, Sam Chen and his eldest boy. Tom Walsh. Morrison would come, but he's keeping order in town." "Against 20. Eve checked her ammunition. "Not good odds." "Depends on the ground," Caleb said, his mother's tactical training surfacing. "This canyon's a natural fortress if we use it right." They'd barely finished positioning their defenders when Davenport's attack began. No warning, no ceremony, just sudden violence as riders charged from 3 directions. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Eve fired from the clinic window, forcing herself to aim carefully, make each shot count. Beside her, Caleb worked the rifle Edmund had taught him to use. covering the eastern approach. Carlos and his men held the high ground, their knowledge of positioning crucial. Every shot from above found its mark, forcing attackers to seek cover. Sam Chen, who'd learned marksmanship in the California goldfields, proved deadly accurate. But Davenport had brought oil and torches. "Fire!" Tom Walsh shouted as flames began licking at the supply shed. Eve started toward it. Their medical supplies were stored there, but Caleb pulled her back as bullets shattered the window where she'd been standing. "Let it burn," he said harshly. "Supplies can be replaced." The fire spread to the corral. Moses and Eve's mare, thank God, had been released into the canyon depths at first light, but the smoke began filling their defensive positions. Davenport had planned well. Then Eve heard a sound that chilled her blood. Wounded men crying out. Not their own, but Davenport's fighters, abandoned where they'd fallen. "Cover me," she told Caleb. Eve, no. But she was already moving, medical bag in hand, using smoke as cover. The first wounded man she reached tried to grab his gun, but his shattered arm wouldn't cooperate. "Lie still," she ordered, cutting away his sleeve, "unless you prefer bleeding to death." The firing slackened as both sides watched the impossible, a woman tending enemy wounded under fire. Eve worked quickly, applying tourniquets, packing wounds, moving from man to man with clinical efficiency. "What the hell are you doing?" Davenport roared. "My job," Eve called back, not pausing in her work. "Something you might not understand." A young gunman, barely 18, clutched at her arm. "Why?" he gasped through pain. "Because you're hurt," Eve said simply, "and I'm a doctor." The moment stretched taut. Then one of Davenport's men lowered his rifle. "I ain't shooting no woman tending wounded," he declared. "Not even for gold." Others followed suit. The professional killers Davenport had hired might be hard men, but they had their own code. Shooting a woman healing their comrades crossed a line even they wouldn't breach. "Get back here," Davenport screamed at his wavering men. "Finish the job." But momentum had shifted. Carlos seized the opportunity, leading a charge from the heights. The vaqueros rode like demons, scattering the demoralized attackers. Caleb and the others pushed from the clinic, catching Davenport's force in a crossfire. The battle became a rout. Hired guns decided no amount of gold was worth dying for a personal vendetta. They fled, leaving Davenport with only his most loyal and foolish supporters. In the chaos, Eve saw young Timothy Morrison fall, clutching his stomach. The boy had snuck back, wanting to help despite being sick. Without thinking, she ran to him, pulling him to cover as bullets whined overhead. "Stupid boy," she muttered, hands already assessing the wound. "What would your mother say?" "That you'd save me," Timothy gasped. The wound was bad bullet through the intestines, usually fatal. But Eve had learned things in the territory that Eastern medical schools never taught. Using techniques Caleb's mother's people knew, combined with her surgical training, she worked to save the boy who'd once warned them of danger. Caleb found them there, Eve blood-soaked but focused, performing field surgery while the battle raged. He stood guard, picking off anyone who threatened them. Until suddenly, silence fell. Davenport stood alone among the bodies of his supporters, clothes torn, face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You," he pointed at Caleb. "This is all your fault. If you just died like you were supposed to." Carlos's lasso settled around his shoulders. Yanking him from his horse, the vaqueros surrounded him, faces grim. "No," Caleb said firmly. "We're not them. Sheriff Morrison can have him." "After what he's done," Carlos protested. "Because of what he's done," Eve said, not looking up from her patient. "Let the law handle him. Real law, not his version." As if summoned, Morrison appeared with a posse of townspeople. They'd heard the gunfire, seen the smoke, and come ready to enforce peace. "Lyle Davenport," Morrison said formally. You're under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Davenport laughed bitterly. Arrest you? Think this changes anything? The railroad will send others. That breed and his whore will never be safe. Caleb's fist connected with his jaw, dropping him cold. Sorry, Sheriff, he said calmly. He was resisting. Morrison's lips twitched. So I see. Tom, help me get him secured. The rest of the day blurred together, tending wounded, friend and foe alike, fighting the fires before they consumed everything, counting the cost in blood and bullets. 3 of Davenport's men had died, along with 2 vaqueros who'd ridden with Carlos. Each death weighed heavy, even those of enemies. As sunset painted the canyon walls crimson, Eve finally finished with Timothy. The boy would live, though he'd carry scars. His mother wept with relief, blessing Eve in broken words. You saved enemies today, Father Miguel observed, having arrived to give last rites. Men who came to kill you. A doctor saves who she can. Eve replied wearily, That's the only way I know. The priest smiled. Perhaps that's why you're winning. Not with bullets, but with something stronger. Caleb found Eve later at the creek, washing blood from her hands. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching. It's not over, he said quietly. No, she agreed. But something changed today. Did you see even hired killers have lines they won't cross? We showed them something they didn't expect. Mercy. Humanity. Eve dried her hands slowly. Davenport thought fear and gold could buy anything, but when men see healing where they expect hatred, they remember they're human too, Caleb finished. They sat in companionable silence as stars emerged. The canyon bore scars, buildings burned, blood soaked into sand, but it endured, like them. We'll rebuild, Eve said, stronger this time, and when the railroad sends others, we'll be ready, Caleb agreed. With more than guns, with a community that's seen what we truly stand for. In the distance, a nighthawk called, its cry echoing off ancient stones. The desert didn't care about human conflicts, but it remembered everything. And tomorrow, when the sun rose on their battered but unbroken home, it would remember this, that sometimes, in the hardest of places, mercy proved mightier than violence, and 2 people's stubborn love could change the course of rivers. The circuit judge from Prescott arrived 2 weeks later, a thin man named Theodore Blackstone, whose reputation for fairness preceded him. The trial was set for the following Monday, to be held in the largest building available, ironically, Davenport's own warehouse. Eve spent the days before preparing testimony, but her real work continued. The wounded from both sides still needed care, and she moved between them without discrimination. Some of Davenport's hired guns, recovering under her treatment, began to question what they'd been told about the savage doctor and her breed husband. You could have let me die, one said, a Texan named Wade with a shattered shoulder. Why didn't you? Because I took an oath, Eve replied, checking his bandages. First, do no harm. That includes letting men die when I can save them. The man was quiet for a moment. Davenport said you were corrupting the natural order, but seems to me hate's more corrupting than healing. Word of such conversations spread. By the time the trial began, the town's mood had shifted perceptibly. The warehouse filled with spectators, townspeople, miners, ranchers, even some Apache scouts from Fort McDowell who'd heard about Caleb's stand. Davenport, flanked by guards, still projected arrogance. He'd hired Lawrence Pemberton from Phoenix, a lawyer known for getting wealthy men out of tight spots. Your Honor, Pemberton began smoothly. This is a simple case of a businessman defending his community against lawless elements. The mixing of races, the breakdown of social order, is not what's on trial, Judge Blackstone interrupted dryly. The charges are attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Proceed with relevant arguments. The prosecution, led by a young lawyer named David Harper, whom the town had scraped together funds to hire, laid out the facts methodically. Witnesses testified Sam Chen about the night attacks, Father Miguel about the threats, Sheriff Morrison about the evidence found at Davenport's ranch. Then Eve took the stand. "State your name and occupation," Harper instructed. "Dr. Eve Whitehawk. I'm a physician licensed in Ohio, practicing in Arizona Territory." Pemberton jumped up. "Objection. No woman can be legally licensed." "Overruled," Blackstone said. "I've seen her credentials. They're valid. Continue. Doctor." Eve testified calmly about the escalating harassment, the attack on the clinic, the battle in the canyon. She spoke of treating wounded men who'd come to kill her, of choosing healing over hatred. "Why did you treat enemy wounded?" Harper asked. "Because they were wounded," Eve said simply. "A doctor doesn't choose patients based on their moral standing. We treat suffering wherever we find it." Pemberton's cross-examination was harsh. "Isn't it true you're living in sin with a known criminal?" "I'm married to Caleb Whitehawk by Father Miguel Torres, in accordance with territorial law. And a half-breed outlaw. A man who served his time for past mistakes and now helps heal this community." Eve's voice remained level. "Which is more than Mr. Davenport can say." When Caleb testified, tension filled the warehouse. He spoke honestly about his past, his time with Marcus Redstone's gang, his capture and redemption. "I was lost," he said quietly. "Caught between worlds, belonging nowhere. Stealing seemed like the only way to survive. But Dr. Whitehawk showed me another path. Now I help save lives instead of threatening them." "Pretty words," Pemberton sneered. "But you're still a thief and a savage." Caleb met his gaze steadily. "I was a thief. As for savage, I've seen more savagery from men in fine suits than from any Apache or Mexican. Savagery is burning out healers because they don't fit your idea of proper society." The decisive testimony came from an unexpected source. Robert Brennan, transferred from Yuma prison to testify, took the stand in shackles. "Davenport and I were partners," he said, his cultured voice carrying clearly. "In land speculation, mostly. When the railroad expansion slowed, we needed ways to acquire property cheaply, running out undesirables, Mexicans, Chinese, Indians. Anyone who wouldn't sell was standard practice." "And the Whitehawks," Harper prompted. "Davenport had personal reasons. The breed, sorry. Mr. Whitehawk had refused to scout against the Apache bands, made Davenport look weak. And the woman—" Brennan smirked. "A female doctor who wouldn't defer to male authority. Davenport couldn't stand it. Said she was an affront to God's order. So the attacks, all planned, make life impossible until they fled or died. Either worked." Brennan shrugged. "It was business, nothing personal." Eve felt Caleb's hand tighten on hers. "Nothing personal. Lives destroyed, people killed, all for business." Davenport's defense crumbled. Witnesses he'd counted on refused to lie under oath. The men who'd survived the canyon battle, treated by Eve, wouldn't testify against her. One even spoke in her defense. "She could have let us bleed out," Wade said from the stand, arm still in a sling. "Instead, she saved us. That ain't the act of someone corrupting society. That's Christian charity, pure and simple." In his closing argument, Harper spoke passionately about justice, about the territory's need for law that protected all citizens, regardless of race or gender. Pemberton countered with appeals to tradition, to maintaining social order. Judge Blackstone deliberated for exactly 1 hour. "Lyle Davenport," he announced, "this court finds you guilty on all charges." The warehouse erupted, cheers from some, angry shouts from Davenport's remaining supporters. Eve sat very still, hardly believing it was over. "Furthermore," Blackstone continued, raising his voice, "this court orders you to pay damages to the Whitehawks for destruction of property and attempted murder. Your assets will be liquidated to cover these costs and those of your other victims." "You can't do this," Davenport screamed. "The railroad will hear about this. Proper society will—" "Proper society," Blackstone said coldly, "doesn't hire assassins. 10 years hard labor. Yuma Territorial Prison. Sheriff, remove the prisoner." As Morrison dragged Davenport away, still screaming threats, Eve felt years of tension finally ease. It wasn't complete victory. Racism and prejudice wouldn't vanish with one man's conviction, but it was justice, served fairly and publicly. Outside the warehouse, a crowd gathered. Not a mob this time, but neighbors. The Delgados brought food. Chen's family offered silk for new curtains. Miners pledged labor to rebuild what fire had taken. "Speech!" someone called out. Eve looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly. She stepped forward, voice carrying in the clear air. "We're healers," she said simply. "That's all we've ever claimed to be. Tomorrow, our clinic reopens. Anyone who needs care will receive it, regardless of who they are or what they believe. That's our answer to hatred healing, one patient at a time." Father Miguel raised his voice. "To the Whitehawks, to justice." The crowd took up the cry. Even some who'd stood with Davenport joined in, perhaps seeing which way the wind now blew, perhaps genuinely changed by what they'd witnessed. That evening, Eve and Caleb stood in their damaged but not destroyed clinic. Caleb had news from Carlos. Several families wanted to send their children to learn medicine, if the Whitehawks would teach them. "An apprentice program," Eve mused. "Training healers from all communities." "Dangerous," Caleb warned. "There are still those who think mixing races is abomination." "Everything we do is dangerous." Eve turned in his arms, looking up at his beloved face. "But imagine Apache children learning alongside Mexican and Chinese and white, all becoming healers. Your father would be proud. Edmund, too." She touched the photograph they'd rehung on the repaired wall. He believed medicine could bridge any divide. A knock interrupted them. Sheriff Morrison entered with a telegram. "From the Federal Marshal's office," he said. "Thought you'd want to see it right away." Eve read aloud. "Investigation launched into railroad company practices. Stop Territorial Governor supports full inquiry. Stop your testimony requested. Stop Justice Department representative en route. Stop." "It's not over," Morrison warned. "The railroad has deep pockets and long memories." "But it's a start," Caleb said, "and we'll be here when they come." As night settled over the canyon, Eve made her rounds one last time. In the recovery room, former enemies lay side by side, tended equally. It was a small thing, perhaps, but revolutionary in its simplicity. "Ready for bed?" Caleb asked, finding her writing in her journal. "Almost, just documenting today. Someday, people should know what happened here, how healing defeated hatred, at least for a while." She closed the journal and took his offered hand. Together they walked to their quarters, past the construction supplies already gathered for tomorrow's rebuilding. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the desert sky. 40 nights we survived the cold," Caleb murmured. "Now we've survived the fire, too." "And we'll survive whatever comes next," Eve replied. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs, indifferent to human dramas. But in the canyon, 2 healers prepared for sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new possibilities. They'd won more than a trial. They'd won the right to continue their work, to build something lasting in this hard land. The territory was changing, slowly and painfully, but change had to start somewhere. Tonight, it started with justice served and mercy shown, with a community choosing healing over hatred, with 2 people refusing to let love be defeated by fear. It was enough. For now, it was more than ****. 1881, 1890, the years of building, ****. Time moved differently in the desert. measured not in clock ticks but in seasons of drought and rain, in lives saved and lost, in the slow transformation of a canyon clinic into something larger than its founders had ever imagined. Their son arrived on a spring morning in 1882, when the Palo Verde trees bloomed yellow as sunshine. Eve, attended by Maria Delgado and 2 Apache midwives Caleb had brought, delivered the baby in the same room where she'd once fought to save his father's life. "He's perfect," Caleb whispered, cradling the infant whose skin held both his parents' heritage, neither white nor copper, but something uniquely his own. They named him Nathan Edmund Whitehawk, honoring both futures and pasts. Nate, as he came to be called, grew up breathing medicine and desert wisdom in equal measure. By 3, he could identify healing plants by scent. By 5, he was helping organize surgical instruments with the seriousness of a tiny professor. The clinic expanded year by year, with Davenport's seized assets and donations from grateful patients. They built a proper surgery, a recovery ward, and quarters for the apprentices who now came from across the territory. Apache girls learned alongside Mexican boys. Chinese youth worked beside former slaves' children, all united in the desire to heal. "We're creating something new," Eve told a visiting journalist from San Francisco in 1885. "Not just doctors, but bridges between communities." The railroad, chastened by federal investigation, found cooperation more profitable than conflict. They hired Eve to establish clinics along their expanding routes, and Caleb to teach their workers desert survival. It was pragmatic progress, but progress nonetheless. Not all was smooth. In 1887, a diphtheria outbreak tested everything they'd built. Nate, then 5, fell ill despite their precautions. For 7 nights. Eve and Caleb took turns monitoring their son's labored breathing, applying every treatment they knew. "Please," Eve whispered to whatever powers might listen, her scientific rationality crumbling before a mother's fear. "Not him. We've given so much. Not him." On the 8th dawn, Nate's fever broke. He opened eyes that held his mother's determination and his father's depth, and asked for water in a clear voice. Eve wept then, all her professional composure dissolving as Caleb held them both. The outbreak claimed 12 lives before they contained it, but their new apprentices proved invaluable. Working tirelessly, they helped save dozens more. The town that had once rejected Eve now looked to her clinic as its salvation. Changes came to Drybell like flash floods, sudden and transformative. The town incorporated, elected a mayor who wasn't in the railroad's pocket, established a school that admitted all children regardless of race. Not without resistance, not without setbacks, but moving forward nonetheless. Caleb found unexpected purpose in the changing times. When the Army requested scouts who could also serve as medics and interpreters, he trained a new generation men who could bridge worlds as he had learned to do. His manual on desert survival and field medicine became standard issue for Arizona Territory forces. "You're writing history," Eve told him one evening as he worked on revisions by lamplight. "We're living it," he corrected. "Every patient we treat, every apprentice we train, we're changing what's possible." In 1889, word came that shocked everyone Lyle Davenport had died in Yuma prison. Not violently, as many expected, but of a heart attack while working in the prison library. He'd spent his last years, reports said, teaching fellow inmates to read. Even the worst men can change. Father Miguel observed at their weekly dinner. Perhaps his ending was its own kind of redemption. Eve wasn't sure she believed in such neat endings, but she appreciated the priest's optimism. The world was too complex for simple villains and heroes. Even Davenport had loved his son, had built businesses that employed hundreds. Evil, she'd learned, was often just good intentions twisted by fear and greed. By 1890, the Canyon Clinic had become the Whitehawk Medical Institute, officially recognized by the territorial government. 3 of their first apprentices had gone on to formal medical schools back east, returning with degrees to augment their practical training. Others spread across the territory, bringing healing to communities that had never known professional medical care. Nate grew strong and quick, with an uncanny ability to find water in the desert and an endless curiosity about everything. He spoke English, Spanish, Apache, and enough Chinese to help translate at the clinic. Watching him move confidently between worlds, Eve saw hope incarnate. "He'll never know what we knew," Caleb said one day, watching their son play with children of every shade while their parents waited for treatment. "The walls we had to break. He'll have his own walls," Eve replied. "But hopefully we've given him tools to break them." The photograph taken that year showed them all on the clinic's new porch, Eve, in her doctor's coat. Silver threading through her hair, but her spine still straight. Caleb beside her, the years having carved dignity into his features. Nate between them, grinning gap-toothed at the camera, and arranged around them, their extended family of healers brown, black, white, and yellow faces united in purpose. Asterisk, 1895. Full circle asterisk, asterisk. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a young Apache woman who just completed her apprenticeship. Mrs. Whitehawk," she said formally, though Eve had insisted everyone call her by her first name. "This came from Phoenix, marked urgent." Eve read it twice, then handed it to Caleb. The Territorial Medical Board was establishing a new teaching hospital in Phoenix and wanted Eve to head the women's medical training program. It would mean legitimacy, resources, the chance to train hundreds rather than dozens. "It's what you've worked for," Caleb said carefully. "It's what we've worked for," Eve corrected. "But Phoenix, they'd built a life in this canyon. The walls held memories terrible and beautiful. Every corner spoke of struggles overcome, love discovered, community created. Leaving felt like abandoning part of themselves." That evening, they called a gathering. Former patients, current apprentices, the townspeople who'd become family all crowded into the meeting hall they'd built in '93. Eve explained the offer, the opportunities it presented. "But what about us?" young Rosa Chen asked. At 16, she was their most promising surgical student. "What about the clinic?" Eve smiled. "The clinic doesn't need us anymore. It needs you, Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Yazzie, Dr. Washington. They're more than ready to lead. We've planted the seeds. Now it's time for the garden to grow on its own." The debate lasted hours. Some felt betrayed, others excited by the possibilities. Finally, old Tom Walsh, the miner Eve had saved from gangrene 15 years prior, stood. "Seems to me," he said slowly, "that canyon's getting a mite small for what you two have started. Maybe it's time to take this healing to bigger places, but—" He fixed them with a stern look. "You damn well better not forget us." "Impossible," Caleb said simply. "This place made us who we are." They spent months preparing the transition. Every procedure documented, every apprentice evaluated, every community connection carefully transferred. The night before their departure, Eve walked through the canyon one last time. She stopped at the spot where she'd first found Caleb, bleeding in the alkali dust. The salt had long since been washed away by rare rains, but she could still see him there, broken, desperate, on the edge of death. Now he stood beside her, whole and strong, her partner in every sense. "No regrets?" he asked. She considered. The years had brought pain patients lost, battles fought, prejudices that died hard and bloody. But they'd also brought Nate, brought purpose, brought a love deeper than the canyon itself. "None," she said firmly. "You. Only that it took bleeding out to find you." He pulled her close. "But I'd do it again." Their last morning dawned clear and bright. The whole town turned out to see them off a far cry from the suspicious stares that had once greeted Eve. Nate sat proudly on his own horse, a medical bag already slung across his saddle. "You'll visit," Maria Delgado commanded through tears. "This is not goodbye. Never goodbye," Eve agreed. Just until we meet again." As they rode out, Eve turned for one last look. The Whitehawk Medical Institute stood solid against the red rocks, smoke rising from chimneys, the morning sun catching on windows that had once been broken by hatred but now reflected hope. "Ready?" Caleb asked. Eve faced forward, toward Phoenix, toward new challenges and larger battles. Somewhere ahead lay the future statehood for Arizona, women's suffrage, the slow bend toward justice. They would be part of it all, carrying the lessons of a desert canyon where love had refused to surrender. "Ready," she said. Behind them, the desert remembered everything: the 40 nights of warmth, the bullets and bandages, the careful hands that healed despite the world's objections. And in the Whitehawk Medical Institute, a new generation took up the work, proving daily that in the hardest ground, with enough patience and courage, anything could grow. The legend would live on, told differently by each community, but always with the same heart. For 40 nights she warmed the cowboy with her body until he finally opened his eyes. But those who knew them understood the deeper truth. They had opened each other's eyes, and in doing so, helped a corner of the world see clearly for the first time. In the distance, an eagle circled lazily in the thermal currents, indifferent to human struggles but part of the same vast sky. And beneath that sky, the work of healing continued, one patient, one student, one carefully sutured wound at a time. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Old West, where love and justice prevailed against all odds. I'm curious, where are you listening to this story from? Please share your location in the comments below so we can connect as a community. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts about Eve and Caleb's journey. Did their story of healing and hope touch your heart as it did mine? Share your reflections below.